Alright, I'm going to do a voiceover over our nervous system PowerPoint. This is coming from the 6th edition of our yellow book, our Illustrated Anatomy of the Head and Neck. And this is just an overview. I'm going to take you kind of deep on some of these slides so that you can remember the basic things that we talked about in class and that I'm going to try to highlight as I talk through this. The nervous system in general is an extensive network of neural structures that activate, coordinate, and control all functions of the body. It causes muscles to contract, resulting in facial expression and joint movements. We're focusing on the oral cavity and, of course, mastication and speech. So the nervous system stimulates glands to secrete and regulate systems of the body like the vascular system and digestive system. And the nervous system also allows sensation to be perceived, such as pain and touch during dental treatment. Now we're going to be looking at the two parts of the nervous system, the central nervous system, including the brain and spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, which is including afferent sensory nerves, efferent motor nerves, and working its way down to the cranial nerves, which will be a big focus of this unit in oral anatomy, this initial class. So the CNS is the brain and spinal cord. The brain has 3 different parts, and they're listed under here. The cerebrum is the largest area with 2 central hemispheres. We'll see a picture in just a minute. The cerebrum coordinates sensory data and motor functions, governs intelligence, reasoning, learning, and memory. The cerebellum, which is the second largest portion, produces muscle coordination, maintains muscle tone and balance. And then we've got the brainstem. For the brainstem, there are 3 different parts. The medulla regulates the heartbeat, breathing, and blood pressure. The pons connects the medulla and cerebellum with higher brain centers, and it has cell bodies for cranial nerves 5 and 7, found in the pons. And then the midbrain is a relay station for hearing, vision, and motor pathways. Another part of the brain, further to the right, is the diencephalon, which further breaks into the hypothalamus, which regulates homeostasis and centers for thirst, hunger, blood pressure, and temperature, and then the thalamus, which is a relay point for incoming nerve impulses. And this should all be a refresher for you, so nothing that you haven't heard of. We finally have the spinal cord as part of the central nervous system, and that links the brain to the rest of the body. We further need to look at the meninges, and I'm going to go to the next slide. Here's a picture of the brain, which includes the cerebrum, which is the largest part, the cerebellum, the second largest, and the brainstem and diencephalon. So you can see in the picture here. The cerebrum is the largest, like I said, consisting of those 2 central hemispheres, coordinates sensory data, motor function, governs intelligence, reasoning, learning, and memory. Cerebellum, second largest division, produces muscle coordination, muscle tone, and balance. Then we've got the brainstem with the medulla pons and the midbrain. Medulla closest to the spinal cord, regulating heartbeat, breathing, and blood pressure. Pons connecting the medulla with the cerebellum and the higher brain centers, and then the midbrain, which includes relay stations for hearing, vision, and motor pathways. Superior to the brainstem is the diencephalon, which includes the thalamus and hypothalamus. Thalamus as the central relay portion or point for incoming nerve impulses, and the hypothalamus, which regulates homeostasis, the centers for thirst, hunger, blood pressure, and temperature. And then the spinal cord linking the brain to the rest of the body. Now that we've got that picture in our head, the CNS is surrounded by bone and a system of membranes containing cerebrospinal fluid. These membranes are meninges. Meninges have 3 layers. If you look at, we've been talking about the cavernous sinus and the pterygoid plexus. This dura mater is the most important layer of the meninges, and that surrounds and supports large venous channels in the brain. It supports the area around those large venous channels, the dural sinuses. There is also, just to finish, I'll go back to that slide real quick, because there's the dura mater, the arachnoid matter, and the pia mater. Those are the other two layers in this picture up above. But the dura mater is the one that surrounds and supports large venous channels in the brain. Now going back to this picture, we're going to look at the other side, so the left side, the peripheral nervous system. This is composed of all the nerves stretching the pathways among the central nervous system and receptors, muscles, and glands. Cranial nerves are an important part of this PNS, the peripheral nervous system. It's further divided into the afferent nervous system or sensory nervous system, which carries information from the receptors to the brain. This is the one where in class I said you can remember afferent as just sensory. It just takes everything in. So it takes it from the receptors. If I touch the hot stove, it takes it from my fingertips to the brain. It carries sensory information such as taste, pain, and proprioception to the brain. Now efferent was the one where I said ee. Now we touched the hot stove. The afferent nervous system took that information to the brain, and the get my hand off of the stove, is coming from the efferent nervous system, which carries information from the brain to the muscle or gland to make them contract. So efferent nerves carry information to the muscles in order to activate them, often in response to the information received by way of the afferent nerves. A nerve cell leading from the eye to the brain carries visual information as part of the afferent or sensory nervous system. A nerve cell leading from the brain to the muscles controlling the eye movement are a part of the efferent or motor nervous system. You'll have to know those because there will be some questions on those on the test. Going back just to take a look at this again. We have the somatic and autonomic part of the peripheral nervous system. The somatic nervous system is a subdivision of the efferent division of the peripheral nervous system, includes all nerves controlling the muscular system and external sensory receptors. It involves both receptors and effectors. The autonomic is the other, operates without any conscious control as the body caretaker. Then under the autonomic, we have the sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic is fight or flight, shuts down salivary glands with certain medications, so xerostomia. And then parasympathetic nervous system is the rest and digest, stimulates salivary gland secretion and aids in digestion. And the parasympathetic fibers are associated with the glands of the head and neck region, are carried within various cranial nerves, and we will talk in greater detail about those cranial nerves. The ganglion are located in the head, and therefore parasympathetic neurons in this region may be either preganglionic neurons before relaying in the ganglion or postganglionic neurons after relaying in the ganglion. We'll talk about that a lot further. This is some of the deep information. You need to know that the cranial parts are part of the peripheral nervous system. Couple definitions, just so you can think about how the nervous system is conducting the business. The neuron is a cellular component of the nervous system and is composed of a cell body and neural processes. And then a nerve is a bundle of neural processes outside the central nervous system in the peripheral nervous system. The synapse is the junction between the two neurons, or between a neuron and an organ, where the impulses are transmitted. And in order to function, tissue structures and organs have innervation, a supply of nerves to that part of the body. So the nerve allows information to be carried to and from the brain, which is the central information center. To have the impulse cross the synapse to another cell requires neurotransmitters, or a chemical agent from the neuron, which is discharged with the arrival of the action potential. We talked about the cell having a resting potential, so where the sodium and potassium balance is maintained by a sodium-potassium pump. And then with the action potential, The sodium gates open and action at one spot on the membrane propagates the impulse along the length of the cell membrane. So it's a temporary reversal of the electric potential along the membrane for a brief period. And this is less than a millisection. It begins at one spot on the membrane but spreads to adjacent areas, and it propagates that impulse along the length of the cell membrane. Refractory period is when the membrane can't be stimulated and it prevents an impulse from being transmitted backwards. That's a period during which the membrane cannot be re-stimulated. So this is important because local anesthesia agents such as lidocaine mimic the inhibitory neurotransmitters by decreasing the sensory neuron's ability to generate the action potential, thus producing localized anesthetic. Anesthesia is the loss or feeling of sensation resulting from the use of a certain drug or gas that serves as an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So anesthesia is the fact that we can give anesthesia, and we need to know what we're giving, why, and where we're giving it. That's what makes the nervous system so important for us, is we're going to be blocking an impulse at a certain point, blocking an impulse from going to the brain. All right, and part of the peripheral nervous system that we are the most going to focus on the most are the cranial nerves. So we have the skulls on the table in the classroom, and we need to remember some of our parts of the skull that we learned in the bones segment. So we're going to look at the skull in detail. We've got cranial nerve number 1, the olfactory nerve coming through the cribriform plate with the crista galli coming through into the brain. Remember, crystal in the crib, and crystal in the crib is coming from the VPP. And then we've got superior orbital fissure. We've got our ROS, our rotundum ovale spinosa. We're going to have to know where the jugular foramen is, where the hypoglossal canal is. So this is just kind of a review of some of the structures. We've got the skulls in the classroom, but this is a good picture. Now, some cranial nerves are sensory or motor, and others have both segments in their neural processes. We are using Roman numerals 1 through 12 to designate the cranial nerves. And so we have 1 through 12 listed, and here is the table from your book in chapter 8. And we have olfactory, optic, oculomotor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducent, spatial, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal. Now there are a lot of different mnemonics that people have learned to remember the cranial nerves in order. I have told you guys in class, and the way that I learned it was ooh, 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 to touch and feel very good velvet, ah. And that's taking the first letter of all of the different nerves and then using those and writing my numbers 1 through 12, and then right next to that, those first letters, and kind of filling it in from there. I have that grid within your lab packet for you to do that, and for you to keep rewriting and keep kind of spitting that out. So here's the cranial nerves 1 through 12, and these are just pictures of where the cranial nerves, kind of their function almost. And this is in your lab workbook. And again, another picture that shows exactly where that cranial nerve is going as far as what area and what function. Another picture of the skull base with all of the nerves and where they're going through. And then here is the grid. So we have the name of the cranial nerve, ooh, 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 oh, 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 to touch and feel very good velvet, ah. And then for sensory or motor, we have the acronym of some say, or Shram says, marry money, but my brother says big butts mean more. And the S is for just sensory, the M is for just motor, and then the B is for sensory and motor. So you can see cranial nerve number 1 is sensory, olfactory. The sensation or the sensory portion is smell, and it comes through the cribriform plate. Now I want you guys to make the connection that, okay, we know where the cribriform plate is, but remember the crista galli comes up through there from the vertical perpendicular plate, because on your final exam you're going to have me pointing to things at the skull, and I'm going to ask several questions that kind of connect all of that for you. So it's not just remembering cribriform plate, but think a little beyond that. I'm going to go back for just 1 second because we're heading into the trigeminal nerve, and I'm going to do a separate recording for that so that it doesn't get too long. So when we go down this list, some say marry money, but my brother says big butts mean more, and then ooh, 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 to touch and feel, very good velvet, ah. We've got our song that we also do. The olfactory is the first cranial nerve, and it has a funny kind of smell. The optic is the second cranial nerve. 2 helps you see. 1 has a funny kind of smell. Now number 2 is going through the optic canal. Thank goodness, optic and optic. Now the next 3 of them are parts of number 5. We've got number 3, oculomotor. Oculomotor is the third cranial nerve. Eyes up and down. 2 helps you see. 1 has a funny kind of smell. Make sure that you know the oculomotor is eyes up and down, and then it comes through the superior orbital fissure. We're going up before we go down, because the trochlear, cranial nerve 4, eyes down and up. Superior orbital fissure. The trigeminal we'll get into a lot more, but this is sensory and motor to the muscles of mastication. We have 3 different branches of the trigeminal. V1, our optic area, goes through the superior orbital fissure. V2 goes through the foramen rotundum, and V3 goes through the foramen ovale. Now we've got the eyes moving up and down and up for 3 and 4. Those are motor functions. Then we've got trigeminal is both, and then abducens is another eye, which is motor. We're moving the eyes side to side. And thank goodness, anything related to the eyes and the eye function is going through the superior orbital fissure, except the sensory optic going through the optic canal. For the facial, cranial nerve 7, which we'll go into in more detail, that is both sensory and motor for facial expression. Our nerve entrance is a stylomastoid foramen and the internal acoustic meatus. We've got number 8, which is sensory, the vestibulocochlear, which is hearing and balance, and it comes through the internal acoustic meatus. So there's 2 of them, 7 and 8, that go at least partially through the internal acoustic meatus. And then we've got the glossopharyngeal, number 9, which is both. This is important, the taste to the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, and then the pharynx. So glosso for tongue, pharyngeal for pharynx. This is coming through the jugular foramen and the foramen ovale. Then we've got the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve 10, which has both sensory and motor. This is the eating nerve. This is the longest nerve that gives you taste at the epiglottis, skin around the ear, soft palate, pharynx, larynx, organs in the thorax and the abdomen. So think about it going all the way from the epiglottis all the way down to the abdomen. So that's a very long cranial nerve coming through the jugular foramen. And then we've got the accessory, which is a motor nerve, cranial nerve number 11, which shrugs the shoulders, the trapezius and sternocleidomastoid. And this also comes through the jugular foramen. The motor for cranial nerve 12 is the hypoglossal, supplies the geniohyoid and muscles of the tongue. And thank goodness the hypoglossal nerve comes through the hypoglossal canal. So I've got this paper in your lab packet for you to laminate or put in a sleeve so you can go over and over writing down your acronym to get down your first letters of the cranial nerves, and then also to get down your S, M, or B for sensory motor, or both. I'm going to go to another video for the trigeminal and the facial.